philosophical, legal, scientific evidence just to argue that I've got a good reason to psychologically doubt.
Well,
or to philosophically
I'm
doubt.
sorry, but that's the way reality goes. See, the thing is, the time to believe something is after there's evidence for it. The time to believe something is not after you've failed to find a defeater for the opposition.
We'll give you the last
Well,
one,
again, the
Ben,
evidence
and then
for
we gotta go
me,
to the next
the strong evidence winds up being something that must be axiomatic. If it isn't that strong, I'm not going to believe it.
What is going on, everyone? So glad you made it here for this one, because honestly, this might be one of the most thought-provoking exchanges I have come across in a long time. So here is what you are about to watch. Ben Fischer, a Christian minister and apologist, sits down with Matt Dillahunty, one of the most well-known atheist debaters out there, on the Modern Day Debate channel. The topic is whether there is actually good evidence for the existence of God, and what unfolds is something I genuinely did not see coming. Because at a certain point, Ben reveals something about how he reached his own belief that changes the entire conversation. But trust me when I say you want to stick around for the full thing, because the moment this builds toward is the kind of thing that is going to make you stop and actually think, regardless of where you personally stand on this topic. Also, really quick, drop me a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now, whether you are across the street or on the other side of the planet. I genuinely love seeing where this reaches, and it means more than you know. All right, let us get into it.
Because so first of all, if God can't manifest in reality in some detectable way, then that God's existence is indistinguishable from its non-existence. If there is no manifestation in reality, then from our perspective, because we're stuck in reality and we don't have the ability to peer outside of reality for any sort of verification, that God's existence is indistinguishable from its non-existence. And so anybody who believes in a God that they think does not manifest in a detectable way in reality, and I'm happy to see that Ben isn't one of them, but anybody who does believe in that is saying, I believe in a God that isn't testable, falsifiable, that isn't capable of providing me any evidence for its existence in an epistemic sense. Gotcha. And so you must be talking about a God that manifests in reality. Otherwise, you're claiming to detect the undetectable. And if you can detect a God that manifests in reality, then now it's an empirical question of please show which things are God manifesting and how we can identify that the actual explanation for this thing that we're calling a manifestation is God. That connection between observation and cause for or explanation for that observation is the key to all of this. And yet that's the thing that's missing. And it's the thing I was coming here for, was the evidence that connects. Hey, yeah. I've observed this in reality, and the best explanation for it is God, and here's why.
And let me say that I think that
response, Ben, and then we must go to the next one.
Okay. In that case, let's move on.
Gotcha. Thanks for your... And then Bruce Wayne, thanks for your question, said, I have good evidence for the non-existence of any gods. It's the axiom that gods do not exist. QED. I don't know what QED means, though.
QED, it means that proves it.
Oh. Ben, we'll give you a chance to respond if you want, if you feel like you've already addressed a variation of it.
Well, I would simply suggest that unless you could show that there was something wrong with the presentation I gave, which was a demonstration that God in his existence, that he is axiomatically present in any world that we imagine. Well, unless you could show that was somehow wrong, I don't see, it seems to me that we're just stuck with the notion that he does. If he can't be conceptually erased, then it seems to me that we're stuck with him.
Alex Gross, thanks for your question, said, why would the strongest argument for God be an esoteric appeal to a personally assumed set of epistemological claims? Is God trying to hide from us?
It's an interesting question, and I assume that one is for me. Since
I'm pretty well known for the argument from divine hiddenness as an actual argument against the existence of God, and so that's probably why somebody's asking it.
Probably why it was brought up, yeah. And certainly the biblical authors themselves seem to ask that very question, Lord, why hidest thou thy face? from me. And I think that is one of the strongest existential reasons that people rally to the fore to refute the existence of God. But it doesn't seem to me that it has a philosophical rub. It seems to me that it has more of an existential rub. And that's why I don't find that I am singularly persuaded by this notion. It isn't powerful enough in that sense to overcome the conviction that results from the realization that God's existence may be axiomatically demonstrated.
Thank you very much. And Harley Quinn, thanks for your question, said, standards of evidence must be shared to be meaningful, relevant to the discussion.
Agreed.
And then they say standards exclusive to Matt would be meaningless to both parties. It's independent verifiability that gives arguments warrant or belief. And then they continue, if Matt was somehow being dismissive, which he isn't, it would nevertheless stand separately from the lack of sufficient evidence for God claims.
This is the argument that cuts through everything, because Matt Dillahunty just drew a line in the sand that is almost impossible to cross. He said something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the most philosophically precise points you will hear in any debate like this one. If God cannot show up in reality in any way that we can detect, then from where we are standing, a God that exists and a God that does not exist look identical. You cannot tell the difference. And if you cannot tell the difference, what exactly are we even debating? You have to understand why this matters so much. It is not just a clever line. It is a structural problem for the entire theistic position. Because the moment you say God is real but completely undetectable, you have removed God from any conversation about evidence entirely. You are not describing a being. You are describing an absence with a name attached to it. And here is what makes Matt's follow-up even sharper. He points out that the missing piece, the thing that was never provided in this entire conversation, is the connection between an observation in reality and the conclusion that God is the best explanation for it. That chain of reasoning. That is what evidence actually looks like. You observe something. You build a model. You test whether God explains it better than anything else. And you show your work. That connection was never established. Not once. And Matt names it directly. That is exactly what he came to this debate looking for, and exactly what never arrived. Here is something worth knowing that most people watching debates like this one miss entirely. This argument has a name in philosophy of religion. It is called the argument from divine hiddenness, and it was developed formally by philosopher John Schellenberg in the late 20th century. Schellenberg argued that if a perfectly loving God existed, that God would ensure that anyone genuinely open to a relationship with him would be able to find him. The fact that sincere seekers remain unconvinced is itself evidence against the existence of such a God. Matt is not making this exact argument, but the underlying logic is the same. A God who cannot be detected in any way raises serious questions about what we are actually being asked to believe in.
Yeah, this is why I put together, I said an interesting experiment would be to like list 10 things. 5 of them I think we both believe in. 5 of Ben's should be things that he thinks we both agree with. And then the other 5 should be things that we suspect the other person disagrees with. And then when we talk about the evidence that convinced us of the first 5, assuming we get it right, compare that to the nature, the quality, quantity, nature, and assessment of the evidence for the other 5 things. And the one whose worldview is the most consistently applying evidence and evaluation of evidence, the one that is less likely to be engaged in special pleading, the one who doesn't violate Occam's razor by not multiplying entities unnecessarily and claiming that, God is an axiom when this is something that we should be able to demonstrate and not have to assume it axiomatically. I would argue that is the better epistemology in practice, irrespective of any philosophical notion. That a worldview consistently applied, where you're not like, oh, I'll accept this evidence except for that. Or because one of the problems, especially if you start defending generic God notions or very generic God concepts, is that now you still have within that overarching category of God a bunch of different options, and they are mutually exclusive and contradictory. I mean, you can't have both Allah in the Muslim sense and Yahweh in the Jewish sense be correct and true. Only one of those two, if either, could be correct. And so this is how we're going to try to drill down. And I'm, like I said, I'm not attacking Ben for this because Ben came to defend it particularly. This would be the starting point. Like if we can show there is a God and we get to agree on that, then we start working out which God is probably the right one. So I'm not faulting Ben for that, but it's a really difficult situation to say, well, yes, there's good evidence, and it's because, I don't know, I'm harping on it again. We'll go on to whatever question. I don't need to repeat my objections.
And this is where Matt Dillahunty does something genuinely clever that I do not think gets enough attention. He proposes a test, not a philosophical framework, not an abstract argument, an actual practical test that anyone could do. List the things you believe. Compare how you arrived at each one. Then look at whether the process you used for the ordinary beliefs is the same process you used for the extraordinary ones. Because here is what Matt is really saying. If your epistemology is solid, it should work consistently. It should not suddenly change rules when the topic is God. And then he drops the line that I think is the most underrated moment in this entire segment. He says he could take Ben's axiomatic framework and use it to justify believing in absolutely anything. Not just the Christian God, any system, any belief structure at all. Yahweh, Allah, a completely invented deity. It does not matter. If axiomatic assumption is good enough evidence for one, it is good enough for all of them equally. This is the part that blows my mind, because Ben never addresses this. He cannot. If your method of arriving at a belief does not distinguish between your belief and every competing belief, then your method is not doing any actual work. It is not filtering truth from fiction. It is just confirming whatever you already decided to believe before you started. Think about it like a compass that points in every direction at once. That is not a compass. That is just a needle. And a belief system that can justify any conclusion equally is not a belief system. It is just a starting assumption wearing the costume of reasoning.
You got it. Thanks for this one is a question from, I lost my spot. This one, Maynard Saves, thanks for your question, said, James, would you debate Matt on this exact topic if given the opportunity? That would be juicy. I haven't debated in a long time, maybe someday. And thanks for your question from Dildo Baggins. Glad to see you. Says, I know what that one means. It says, did you screen these interlocutors? That's just an inside joke because one time Darth Dawkins, who I think, Matt, Darth Dawkins.
I think he's called the show. I don't know all that much. Despite what people think, I don't hang out with and worry about every little YouTuber out there. I think he's called the show. I think he's no longer allowed to call. I don't know.
Yeah, we've had a run-in with him as well. So that's an inside joke about Darth. Johnny Moe, thanks for your question, said, question for Ben, is there anything that would convince you that God doesn't exist or probably doesn't exist? If so, specifically, what would it take?
I've thought about that question a lot. And a lot of my conclusions came out of a season of personal wrestling, as I shared with Matt prior to coming live on Modern Day Debate, that I'd encountered a season of profound existential crisis, and that all of the tenets of my faith were brought into question in that short season. And as I resolved how I was going to leave that season or not, I reasoned that I wasn't simply going to allow myself to read the Bible alone, but that if I couldn't find a defeater for the problem of religious skepticism, that I was going to essentially probably cash in my faith, or at least I would have just had to relinquish it on a rational basis. At this point, the reason I'm a Christian is because I feel that these arguments are so strong that I cannot resist the notion that atheism is false. Because I haven't seen a good argument from propositional atheism to convince me that it's true, the argument of evil, etc. And then the other variety, which is just simply lacktheism, Paul Draper refers to this as psychological atheism. There doesn't seem to be a good argument even for psychological atheism.
Sure there is.
That is the state of being.
Sure there is. The argument for it is
they all depend on skepticism. And again, this is an argument which has now, over the past 40 years, been collapsed in secular academia.
It's weird. So first of all, what you've done and what you've just completely described, I would love to go through it in detail at some point when we're not in this, is you basically shifted the burden of proof to, is there a good reason to think people could disprove God? And then when you found what you think is a problem or a defeater for a particular notion that you're calling religious skepticism, without looking at actual skepticism, you're like,
I think the two share precisely the same canonical form. It just
well, they don't. But
we could say charitably, we could say that what about the problem of underdeterminism? But there again, the reason for the underdeterminism becomes the admission to essentially assent to Nozick sensitivity requirement. Again, the closure principle collapses, and I just can't rationally make that sort of an epistemic commitment. Give up philosophical, legal, scientific evidence just to argue that I've got a good reason to psychologically doubt.
Well,
or to philosophically doubt.
I'm sorry, but that's the way reality goes. See, the thing is, the time to believe something is after there's evidence for it. The time to believe something is not after you've failed to find a defeater for the opposition.
We'll give you the last
Well,
one,
again, the
Ben,
evidence
and then
for
we gotta go
me,
to the next
the strong evidence winds up being something that must be axiomatic. If it isn't that strong, I'm not going to believe it.
And then Ben Fischer says it, and I genuinely had to sit with this for a moment because of how revealing it is. Ben explains that the reason he remained a Christian after his period of serious doubt was not that he found compelling positive evidence for God. It was that he could not find a good enough argument against God. He stayed because the opposition did not convince him to leave. Matt's response to this is so precise it almost sounds gentle, but it is one of the most direct corrections in the whole debate. He points out that Ben has completely reversed the burden of proof. The question is not whether atheism has defeated you. The question is whether theism has demonstrated itself. Those are two completely different things, and treating the failure of one as confirmation of the other is not reasoning. It is a gap dressed up as a conclusion, and then Ben closes this entire exchange by saying his strongest evidence is something that must be axiomatic, not demonstrated, not independently verifiable, assumed. That is his final position. Here is what I think is really important for people to take away from this. Ben is clearly a sincere person. He went through genuine doubt. He wrestled with real questions. That matters, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But sincerity is not the same as evidence. You can be completely genuine in your belief and still be operating on a method that cannot distinguish truth from fiction. The two things are independent. What Matt kept asking for and never received was the bridge between personal conviction and publicly examinable reality. Not because personal conviction is worthless, but because in a debate specifically about whether good evidence exists, conviction alone cannot be the answer. And Ben's final line confirms that he knows this too, because the strongest thing he can point to is something he admits cannot be demonstrated. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.